So, on account of Kurt Cobain's birthday today, I wanted to show you a few things about his chart that you may find interesting. So, the first thing I want to mention about Kurt's chart is that he was a Virgo rising, making Mercury, because Mercury is the ruler of Virgo, the ruler of his chart. And Mercury is in Pisces in the sixth house, along with the sun. So, he was very much, I think, addicted to activity. Mercury has ties to the hands. And in addition to being an amazing musician, Kurt was an amazing artist. He was somewhat hyperactive, especially pertaining to things to do with his hands. I think it was his ex-girlfriend who had said she would leave the house in the morning to go to work, and Kurt would be there on the couch, and she'd come back and he'd do a mural or a painting. There was another instance in which he drew a Disney character. I think it was Mickey Mouse, and people thought that he traced it, but really he was just that great of an artist. So Mercury, planet of communication, has ties to the hands, was in the sixth house of his day-to-day activities. And he was very, very productive person. And I don't always think people realize that. His sun is also in the sixth house, which makes him very much focused on the day-to-day processes, things that he does on a day-to-day basis. He was constantly writing, constantly drawing, constantly practicing guitar. Another thing that's interesting is that, Kurt, when we hear about him, junkie, the word junkie usually comes to mind. Well, I mean, for a junkie, he was incredibly productive. So with Mercury here, or Virgo rising, he is very much connected to work. He drove his teammates extremely hard, his bandmates, and he made them practice a lot. He was very insistent that if we don't practice on a regular basis, we're going to sound like shit. And he was very perfectionistic, which is an aspect of being a Virgo rising. In addition to being a Virgo rising, his sun in Pisces, as well as his Mercury, is in the sixth house, which rules Virgo, which gives him a sort of workaholic aspect to his chart. Of course, the big thing about Kurt's chart is this amazing water trine between Neptune in Scorpio at 24, Jupiter in Cancer at 25 degrees, and Chiron at 24 degrees Pisces. So this is a water trine, and trines essentially make things extremely easy for people. You have to mind the trine, they say in astrology, meaning you may have a certain level of gifts in some area, in Kurt's instance, water or emotion, art, music, etc. And oftentimes when we have trines, we take them for granted just because everything comes so easily. But Kurt's water trine in his third house, which rules communication, also the hands, with it being Neptune here, an amazing imagination, making a beautiful trine to his Jupiter in Cancer in this 10th house, which pertains to his career and his achievements. And then also Chiron, which has to do with his woundedness. So a case could be made that he used his third house gifts, his ability to work with his hands and create with his hands, to heal, but to also make a name for himself in the world. This is an amazing water trine. So things did come easy for Kurt in a lot of ways, at least artistically. Another thing that's interesting is that Pluto and Uranus in Virgo are really close to the ascendant, but they're in the 12th house of Virgo's chart. So the 12th house has to do with the subconscious. So Pluto and Uranus have to do with trauma. Pluto has to do with emotional trauma, and Uranus has to do with mental trauma. And in the 12th house, this is what is going on when Kurt is in his mother's stomach. Okay, so the 12th house has to do with the subconscious. Oftentimes it's what's going on with the mother. For instance, when a woman is pregnant and she has a cigarette, she shares that cigarette with the baby. Well, the same thing goes if she's experiencing emotional trauma or mental trauma. the baby is experiencing that too in her stomach. So it would seem here that there was a lot of trauma going on with the mother, mental and emotional, that Kurt inherited. From what we hear about his father, who is not a walk in the park, that makes a lot of sense. So he's coming from a place with the South Node in Scorpio, moving toward this Venusian energy here with the North Node in Taurus in the 8th house. What's interesting is the 8th house does have to do with death and rebirth and metamorphosis. So even if Kurt didn't die so young, chances are he would have been transforming in some very dramatic way because it's in the 8th house. What also is interesting here is that this 19 degrees Pluto and 23 degrees Uranus and the 23 degrees Virgo rising makes oppositions to his Saturn, Venus, Chiron, and Mercury. So there's a very, very strong partnership aspect to this chart, in which a lot of his learning had to do with partnerships, and where he's coming from on a subconscious level and the way he presents himself is very much at odds with the partners that are in his life, but he obviously needs them. With Chiron there, he came into this world with a certain woundedness when it comes to partnerships. What's also interesting here is that with these conjunctions with Saturn, Venus, and Chiron, the highest orb being 4 degrees, Saturn really affects that Venus. So Venus is about love and abundance and beauty and creativity. And Saturn here actually makes that real on a positive level, meaning he has this beautiful Venus, but he actually does something with it with Saturn, but also Venus is restricted by Saturn. So love or abundance for him, or even beauty in some respects, was somewhat restricted with Saturn here. And this is in his 7th house. So his partnerships may have been somewhat work-oriented or entailed a lot of responsibility. And there is a certain level of weightiness, especially pertaining to relationships with Saturn in the 7th house, but also there's blessings and gifts with Venus, and of course pain that he came into this world with Chiron. So partnerships were a huge aspect of Kurt's life. With Venus in the 7th too, very, very positive placement, but with Saturn, it makes it a little bit tough relationships. At the same time, when it comes to creative work, you can actually get a lot done with Saturn, because Saturn wants definition, it wants to make things real. What I think is also really important to note is that Kurt was incredibly ambitious. I don't think you can achieve that much as he did without being very ambitious. And with the moon in Cancer in the 10th house, he had an emotional need for achievement. Like, he needed to achieve things. And with Jupiter here as well, he's very blessed in the sense that Jupiter gives you blessings and luck wherever it's placed in your chart. And although it's retrograde, within himself, he had a sense of achievement, and he had that sense of confidence, which Jupiter gave him. There's a lot of stuff in Kurt's chart, but today I really just wanted to emphasize the Virgo rising and the really strong 6th house, which made him quite a bit of a workhorse, driving himself and his bandmates and perhaps other people that were in his circle rather hard. You know, he really lived and shined in the world with the sun in the 6th, meaning it was about his work. It was about his day-to-day processes. And that's really what gave Kurt so much vitality. And I think that it's important to note that he was quite the perfectionist. And also, of course, he was rather ambitious. I mean, it sort of runs counter to the image that he portrayed, but he would call his manager and be like, why am I not on the cover of this magazine? So it's just very, very interesting. He was a very dynamic, talented man who had so many gifts that he actually did so much with, much more than we would think a junkie could do. So happy birthday to Kurt Cobain. Happy Kurt Cobain's birthday to all of his fans. I hope this video gives you a better understanding of who Kurt was and helps you to appreciate him even more.